I've worked as a security guard for most of my life. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. Gas stations, convenience stores, small shops, places where you're mostly just sitting around, keeping an eye on things. But when I saw the ad for a night shift at the local mall, I thought I'd finally stumbled on something better. The pay was good, better than anything I'd seen in years. The hours weren't bad either, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was just one building, and I figured it would be quiet and easy. How hard could it be? I could already imagine sitting back in the security office, watching the cameras, and walking around in a place that felt too big for the silence of the night. I applied immediately and got a call the next day. It was the manager, Mr. Hensley, asking if I could come in for an interview that afternoon. It seemed sudden, but I didn't question it. I needed the job, and the mall wasn't far from where I lived. I drove over, trying to shake the feeling that this was all happening too fast. Was the mall that desperate for a night guard? The interview was quick, almost rushed. Hensley asked about my experience, but it didn't feel like he was paying attention. He ran through the basics, check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, do hourly patrols. Nothing out of the ordinary. By the end of it, he looked at me and asked, "Can you start tonight?" That surprised me. Most places want time for paperwork or background checks, but I wasn't about to argue. "Sure," I said, trying not to sound too eager. He looked relieved. "Great. We're understaffed," he admitted, rubbing his temples like the day had been too long. "Last few guards didn't last. I hope you'll be different." His words gave me pause. What did he mean by that? But before I could ask, he handed me a key to the office and told me to report at 11 p.m. sharp. The quicker I started, the quicker I'd get paid, I told myself. I shook his hand, left the office, and went home to get a few hours of sleep before my shift. When I arrived at the mall, it was dark and deserted. The parking lot, which during the day was packed with cars, was almost entirely empty. A few scattered vehicles sat under the dim glow of the parking lights, but the space felt too big, too quiet. It made the building look like a sleeping giant, and for a second, I considered turning around and going home. Something felt wrong. I brushed it off as first-day nerves and walked up to the employee entrance. Mr. Hensley met me at the door. He didn't say much, just led me through the winding corridors to the security office, explaining the basic protocols again as we walked. The office itself was small, a cramped room at the back of the mall filled with screens displaying grainy footage from the cameras scattered around the building. "Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, he reminded me. "Do your rounds, make sure nothing's out of place. The usual." He glanced at me before adding, "And keep an eye on the escalators and the play area. Things happen there sometimes." That last part made me pause. "Things happen?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Kids, mostly. Trying to sneak in or mess around after hours. You'll see." I nodded, though his tone made my skin crawl a little. He handed me a printed sheet of standard instructions, shook my hand again, and said, "Good luck. I'll see you in the morning." Once he left, I was alone. The silence of the empty mall settled over me like a heavy blanket. I took a seat in front of the monitors, flipping through the camera feeds. The escalators were still, the stores dark and empty. For a moment I relaxed. It was just a mall, nothing creepy about that. Just a big, empty building. After a few minutes, I felt a presence behind me. I jumped, my heart pounding. There, standing just beside me, was a janitor. He grinned, clearly amused by my reaction. "Didn't mean to scare you, buddy," he said, his voice light. "You must be the new guy." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "Yeah, that's me. I didn't know there was a janitor here at night." He shrugged. "They always keep one of us around to clean up, make sure everything's ready for the next day." His tone turned a bit more serious. "Just make sure you follow the rules." I blinked. "The rules? You mean the instructions?" He handed me a crumpled piece of paper, looking at me with an unsettling seriousness. "These aren't from the manager. These are the rules you'll need if you want to make it through the night. I unfolded the paper, half expecting some kind of joke, but the list of rules it contained was anything but funny. Rules to keep you safe at night. Rule 1. Check the security cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but don't stare at the footage for too long. Rule 2. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If the mannequins change positions, leave the area immediately. I stared at the list, my gut tightening with discomfort. You're serious? The janitor's grin had vanished. I'm warning you, follow the rules or you'll end up like the last guy. I tried to laugh it off. You mean the last guard? He nodded, his eyes cold. He quit after one night. Okay. I stuffed the paper into my pocket without checking the rest of the list, chuckling nervously. Well, I'm going to make my first round. The janitor stepped aside, giving me a long look before saying, "Take care." I nodded and left the office, but his words stuck with me. Something about his tone, his look, it felt off, like he was genuinely afraid. But I wasn't going to let some weird list of rules mess with my head. It was just past midnight when I started my patrol. The mall was eerie at night, much more so than I expected. The dim lighting cast long, twisting shadows along the tiled floors. Every sound felt amplified, my footsteps echoing off the walls, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant creaks and groans of the building settling. As I made my way down one of the main hallways, I tried to focus on the task at hand. The mall wasn't huge, but it was big enough to need regular patrols. There were plenty of stores to check, some of them abandoned, some locked up, with displays peeking out from the darkness behind their glass fronts. A children's play area stood near the food court, silent and still, the colorful plastic toys looking strange and lifeless under the dim emergency lights. Farther down, I could make out the escalators, still and frozen in their usual ascent, like relics from a busier time. I was getting used to the silence when I noticed something strange in one of the clothing stores. The store door was wide open. I stopped, my flashlight sweeping over the darkened interior. I couldn't see anything out of place at first, but as I moved the beam around the store, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, a slight shift, like something or someone was hiding in the dark. I turned my head to look directly at it, but there was nothing. Just a few mannequins standing near the back, as motionless as always. I sighed and shook my head. It was nothing. Just my nerves. I wasn't going to let that janitor's creepy list get into my head. Then I heard it. The faint sound of clothing rustling. My flashlight flicked back toward the mannequins, and there it was. One of them had definitely moved. It was standing a little closer now, slightly out of position compared to the others. I could feel my heartbeat start to quicken. "Hey, Mr. Janitor!" I called out, more out of frustration than anything else. This had to be some kind of prank. He was probably watching me from the shadows, trying to freak me out. But there was no answer. Just the soft, unsettling shuffle of fabric behind me again. I turned slowly, my flashlight scanning the mannequins, and that's when I saw it. One of them had changed positions again, its head now facing directly toward the exit. My breath hitched in my throat. No one else was here. There was no way this was a trick. I backed out of the store quickly. I didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. As I walked away, I kept glancing over my shoulder. And then I heard it. Footsteps. But not normal footsteps. They were heavy, rough, like wood or plastic scraping against the floor. My heart started pounding in my chest. I turned around and there it was, the same mannequin from the store. It stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at me with its blank, lifeless face. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I watched it. Slowly, stiffly, it started to move toward me, its joints creaking and groaning with every step. Its movements were robotic, stiff, like a doll being dragged forward. I did what any sane person would do. I ran. I turned on my heel and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the mall. I didn't care how ridiculous I looked. I just needed to get away from that thing. I rounded the corner, ducking into the hallway that led toward the restrooms. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. I burst into the restroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But as I looked into the mirror, I saw something else. A woman was standing near the stalls, her back to me, dressed in the plain uniform of a cleaning lady. I blinked, and she was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but there was no one there. The restroom was empty. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted and terrified. What was happening? I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of it all, but nothing was adding up. Then I remembered the list. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and unfolded it with shaking hands. There, written plainly in black ink, were the next few rules. Rule 3. If a mannequin looks like it's following you, don't look back. Mannequins sometimes follow guards, but if you ignore them, they'll stop. If you look, they'll know you're aware, and they'll get closer. I felt my heart sink. I had looked. Rule 4. Avoid looking into the mirrors of the restroom. Too late for that. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized I had already broken 2 of the rules. Whatever was happening, I was making it worse. Rule 5. If you hear someone talking inside an abandoned store, do not listen. I swallowed hard. I hadn't heard anyone yet, but just knowing the rule had there made me uneasy. Rule 6. If you hear a child laughing from the play area, leave immediately. Rule 7. If you check the time and it's earlier than the last time you looked, immediately return to the security office. I glanced at my watch, instinctively checking the time. It read 11:30 p.m. My blood ran cold. There was no way it was 11:30. I had started my patrol after midnight, and it had been a while since then. This wasn't possible. I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed out of the restroom, my heart racing as I made my way back toward the security office. The air around me seemed heavier now, more oppressive, and the lights overhead flickered faintly. The mall, once a place I had thought would be quiet and safe, now felt like a living entity, watching and waiting. I reached the office, slamming the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, my nerves frayed. I checked my watch again. It was almost 1 a.m. That seemed right. But what had happened earlier? Why had the time changed like that? I sat down, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to keep my head on straight. I wasn't going to let this place get to me. I pulled out the list again, reading through the remaining rules. Rule 8. Lock the security office door between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., and do not open it for anyone. If they knock, they might not be the person you think they are. Check the cameras to confirm. Rule 9. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. Rule 10. If you hear an escalator running, do not investigate. Watch the area on the security cameras. Rule 11. Under no circumstances should you leave before your shift ends. If you do, you risk something following you outside the mall. I let out a nervous laugh. What kind of job had I taken? Who had written these rules? I couldn't make sense of any of it. But as I sat there, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. The mannequin, the time shifting, the figure in the mirror. This wasn't normal. Whatever was going on, I needed to survive the night. It was past 1 a.m., and I needed to go for another round. As much as I wanted to stay locked in the security office, I knew I had to follow the security protocols also. The cameras showed nothing unusual, so I gathered my courage and stepped back out into the mall. As I walked cautiously through the main hallway, I started hearing something. A faint mumbling coming from an abandoned store. My blood ran cold as I remembered Rule 5. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. The mumbling sound coming from the abandoned store was quiet, barely audible over the faint hum of the mall's air conditioning. But it was unmistakable. There was someone or something talking inside. I forced myself to move, my legs feeling like lead. Rule 5 echoed in my head. If you hear someone talking inside an abandoned store, do not listen. I tried to block out the sound, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the soft, incomprehensible murmurs persisted, growing louder the closer I got to the store. I glanced at the glass storefront. The windows were covered with paper, blocking any view of the inside. My breath hitched as I quickened my pace, refusing to even glance in its direction.